Hello and good evening from Israel. My name is Ashley Perry. Sorry, Stacey is usually here to introduce me, but she's having some technical difficulties, so I'm on my own tonight, at least for now. Hopefully, her issues will be sorted out for the Q&A a little bit later in this webinar. Oh, Stacey, you there? Anyway, I'll get going either way. Hopefully, as I said, Stacey will be able to sort out her technical difficulties. Let's start in a little bit of an unexpected place tonight. We've been talking a lot about elections, about Iran, about a number of issues that have been, taking the headlines. Well, this week, and I'll explain after why it's a matter of importance. If those who remember a year ago on the Jewish festival Lag BaOmer, there's a traditional lighting ceremony on Lag BaOmer, where usually hundreds of thousands of people go up to a mountain in the north of Israel called Meron. Most of them are ultra-Orthodox to celebrate this festival. It's become quite a rite of passage for many in the ultra-Orthodox, chiefly in the ultra-Orthodox community. And if we remember, after really many years of warning, what many feared would happen did happen, and the collapse of a pathway or a stage or whatever it was resulted in the death of 45 people. This was the biggest death toll in any civilian tragedy like this. And as one can imagine, in the days, weeks, and months afterwards, there was a lot of finger pointing. This was towards the end of the Netanyahu era. Well, not to say there won't be another era, but just of the last Netanyahu era. There was fingers pointed at Netanyahu. There was fingers pointed at then Interior Minister Aryeh Deri. There were fingers pointed at Public Security Minister Amir Ohana, and the Police Commissioner, and various others. This government promised, because the previous government, because of a lot of pressure from the ultra-Orthodox community that did not want to look into it, because they were worried about what they may find, and the fact that there was a lot of rabbis who perhaps got involved, and there was a lot of sort of pressure to overlook certain safety measures which weren't quite there. And basically, the government at the time of Netanyahu did not want to look into it, didn't look into it. The ultra-Orthodox members of Knesset refused to even take part in any discussions on a state inquiry. And one of the promises of some of the parties that created what was then called the Change Government promised an official state inquiry. Well, that inquiry took place. It invited many of those that potentially were responsible to come and give evidence. One of those was former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and the big headlines from his comments were he didn't know, and how could he deal with something that he didn't know about? And it was pointed out to him at the time by the justices who were tasked with looking into that investigation, that there were many reports by controllers and others that it was unsafe and unusable, and there should have been additional safety measures which were never put in place. Well, this week, what came out was a letter, or what's called a letter of warning by that commission, that's saying that it's possible that certain figures may be deemed responsible for what happened that night. And one of those letters was sent to former Prime Minister Netanyahu. Now, as we've seen in Israeli politics, former Prime Minister Netanyahu, you either love him or hate him, and he is a bit of a Mr. Teflon, as they refer to people like that in politics, which means that it is rare that his support, that anything will stick to him that will make a large bulk of supporters, not even a majority of supporters, desert him or question him in any way. And one would think in a reasonable time, perhaps in other times, that a letter which potentially deemed a leader responsible for the deaths of 45 people, not to say he has been charged with responsibility, but he may be, and to come before a commission of inquiry and say he didn't know any of this and he couldn't be held responsible, when it was proven, at least in to a certain extent to the court of public opinion, that there were enough reports and there were enough warning signs ahead of this. Now, as I said, in politics, that should be a bit of a blow, perhaps even in other political processes in other countries, that would perhaps even be enough for a politician to step down, or at least if that would have come out, the least you could do as a leader of a party is say, we accepted this letter of warning, we'll look into it, we'll abide by its rulings, we'll look into considerations and implications, etc., etc. That's unfortunately not the way Israeli politics are today. And what the Likud did is sort of a chief tactic of Netanyahu's and his Likud over a number of years, is first of all turn it into a political hot potato and distract and deflect. What they tried to do, the message was that came out, is that this was politically instigated. Well, of course, every state inquiry was instigated by politicians. The ruling parties get to do such a thing, and there have been many throughout the history. But it was an impartial basis, and they did look into many other things. I'm not saying that there were no political influences anywhere, but it is clear from anyone who watched these proceedings that there has to be some accountability. 45 people died, and thus far, no one has taken responsibility. A relatively low down, the food chain police officer did take some responsibility and did resign, but no political heads rolled. Again, that may be in contradistinction to other political arenas around the world, but in Israel, that's not the way it works. In fact, many commentators have suggested, and I think there's a certain plausibility to this, is that it will actually strengthen Netanyahu because it plays into that sort of sense of victimhood that Netanyahu is very good, very adept at creating around political election campaigns. So this, not to say that this is the biggest issue, and I doubt many people will vote on this issue, but what I wanted to demonstrate is how even so-called, big instances, again, massive civilian disaster, 45 lives were lost, 150 people were injured, and no political leader took responsibility. So a state commission of inquiry was created and has now started to point fingers, but it does not seem to have affected their popularity. So that's really just a sort of a little bit of a side note, but an important note to show where we are today in Israeli politics. Moving back sort of a little bit to something that we've talked quite a lot about, and I'm sure we will in the coming weeks, is this return to the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, with the EU leadership saying that it could be signed in a matter of days. There was a bit of a worry earlier in the week from the European or those pro-deal supporters that Iranians were trying to stall again, but now it seems that they've accepted pretty much the American comments or their comments on the EU's offer, and it does seem that we're getting closer and closer to a deal. As I said last week, Israel is trying to put a lot of pressure. It doesn't believe that it can stop the deal. It doesn't even believe necessarily that it can change much of the deal, certainly not at this stage. But there's a lot that Israel can do as far as compliance, as far as making its case that Iran will basically flaunt this deal as it did the last one. It will go way beyond what it's allowed to, but pocket all the dividends from the signed deal. And finally, after a couple of weeks, Prime Minister Yair Lapid spoke to President Biden tonight. There was a readout from the Israeli side. Tellingly, there was no readout from the US side. And again, the vast majority of that conversation was about the Iran deal. The Iran deal has become a bit of a political sort of hot potato in Israel. Former Prime Minister Netanyahu, after not attending security briefings, as is his right and not obligation, but as is his right throughout the last year, has decided he went to one last week, and there was a bit of a to and fro. Will there be a picture taken? Netanyahu doesn't want a picture taken, whereas Lapid does, because obviously of the optics, the dynamics that have changed. Whereas Lapid is the one in the big chair, and Netanyahu is the opposition leader. A picture did go out, but interestingly, to a certain extent, predictably, it was turned into a little bit of a political game, with Netanyahu immediately coming out and saying, if I was worried about a return to the Iran deal before and what this government is doing, I'm even more worried now. Lapid predictably came against him and said, let's not politicize such an important issue. But it's clear that if and when the JCPOA should be signed and returned to, this will certainly become an issue. Netanyahu will try and present it as a failure of this government, even though he himself was not able to prevent the original agreement of 2015. He'll make the case that, and he is making the case, that neither Lapid or his predecessor Bennett went to Congress like he did to try and prevent it, to really go as far as possible. Lapid will claim that didn't work, and in fact it created a partisan atmosphere in the US, which we haven't yet to recover from. Moving further away from the Iran deal and onto the Palestinian issue, one thing also that came up in the conversation, which is something the Americans are trying very hard to do, is to prevent Palestinian Authority leader Mahmoud Abbas from once again trying to proclaim or trying to get a state of Palestine recognized in the UN. They passed it through the General Assembly a number of years ago, and it has a status, in theory at least, akin to the Vatican, not a full member state. It has to go through the Security Council, and as long as there's an American veto, that will not happen. The Americans do not want to get to that point, as they haven't in the past, because they don't want to have to veto it, because it doesn't look good for them diplomatically. So they're trying to push the Palestinians down from this. If they do manage to do it, it will only because they've promised them something. So it remains to be seen exactly what that is. Just a few other issues before we go to question. Last week, we spoke a little bit about a potential teacher strike and how that will play out politically, domestically. The school year is supposed to start tomorrow. And up until a few hours ago, we didn't know if our children were going to school. An agreement was signed, as they say, in the last minute, between the Treasury, the Finance Ministry, the Education Ministry, and the Teachers Union leadership. We talked that a lot of this will play very much around how people perceive Avigdor Lieberman, the leader of Israel Beitenu and the Finance Minister. Someone who really tried to push himself as someone who will hold out, someone who will push for what he believes in, someone who says, I'm not going to play into election politics by basically giving whatever they need, as long as it doesn't make him look bad. He did get quite a lot of achievements out of this agreement, quite a lot of things that he wanted. He wanted some of the pay rise for teachers to be merit-based as opposed to the amount of time they spent in the system. He did want to align some of the school vacation with days that parents have to take off, which was a big issue for him, and even push for more days or less days in the summer holiday, more days of school, and even raise the minimum that an entry-level teacher will get to try and entice more people into the education system. So Lieberman probably won a few points. I don't know if it will last. According to a poll tonight, he's gone up by 1 seat. Again, probably not something that will be remembered into the elections, but maybe something he can, drop his coat on to show that he's prepared to stand up to the unions, the monopolies, and other long-standing groupings in Israel who have run much of Israel's policy. Going to a poll tonight, I mentioned briefly, the poll pretty much, as I said, Israelis or Israeli news have become addicted to polls recently, where there's a poll every couple of days. What has been consistent for the last number of weeks, perhaps even month or 2 months, is the Netanyahu bloc is stuck at 59. And we've talked quite a lot how the magic number there is 61. They need to have 61 to form a government. At the moment, they're really just stuck on 59. And one of the reasons for that is the fact that Ayelet Shaked's Zionist Spirit party with Yoaz Hendel and some others has not been able to pass the electoral threshold and hasn't even really come that close. I think tonight's poll, they were about 2%, where you need 3.25% to have representation in the Knesset. That's not to rule them out, and it's very possible that at one point they could get over the line, and that will probably be a certain boost for Netanyahu, because as much as Shaked and Netanyahu have a history, they don't like each other. Shaked would almost certainly join with Netanyahu in a future government, and that's one of the reasons why a lot of her former Yamina compatriots have left her. Finally, a really interesting moment that happened this week, those who remember Jonathan Pollard, the long-standing Israeli spy who was in American jails for a number of decades, who was released a few years ago. Well, he came out of nowhere to endorse Shaked and saying that she deserves a second chance. She made an error by being in this government, but she's a stalwart, right-wing lover of the land of Israel, etc., etc. All those talking points, and he endorses her and caused people to vote for her. Well, as you can imagine, that caused quite a lot of furore, and it wasn't long in coming, a retraction where basically Jonathan Pollard came out and said, I made a mistake, I didn't understand everything, and I retract my earlier endorsement. Shaked then came out and said, as usual, the camp which is running against me, she didn't mention it by name, but the Netanyahu-Smotrich camp, basically this is what she claimed, that Pollard had received such abuse, including death threats, to retract his endorsement. So that was just a little side note, but just a sort of another example of how the ugly side of Israeli politics, and the fact that if there are endorsements out there, they will be attacked themselves, and it's just become a bit of an ugly arena at the moment, has Israeli politics, and I'm sure there's much to go. Tomorrow, as I said, is the first day of school, September 1st, and a lot of people are saying now that kids are back in school, parents and working people will be able to go back to work, will be able to concentrate on other things, as opposed to keeping their kids occupied and happy as they have for the last 2 months. And this is really where the real election campaign starts. As I said, tomorrow, for many people, the election campaign starts in earnest, and I'm sure throughout September, something I've said before, October is mostly taken by Jewish holidays, so there'll be a lot of stop-starts in the election campaign. September is the last full month with very little disruption, so a lot of the budgets, a lot of the campaigning will be happening over the next month. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions, if we have.
Yes, my apologies. Hopefully you can hear me. So Murray Feldman asks, who is on the commission that will judge Netanyahu? How are they appointed?
Well, I mean, it's already finished now. Now, as I said, it's sending out letters. I can't remember the exact identities. They were appointed by this government. It was a state commission. It was voted on in the Knesset and through committees. And one can imagine, as this government had the majority, they wanted to get their people on. Obviously, you have to, whoever decides on such committees, you have to get largely unimpeachable people, or people who are seen as relatively unbiased. Obviously, any government that appoints a committee that looks into a previous government is going to want to get certain results. So, if you're in Netanyahu's camp, again, the message that they're trying to put out, which is something which is being bought to a certain extent by his people, is that this was politicized, and the fact that they're releasing the results 2 months before elections just shows the political nature of it. Well, on the other side, you could say, and they're saying that this was not where the composition was decided by politicians, but that was where its interference ended. And as soon as it finished its work, that is rightly when it does these things like send out letters, etc. So, there's a bit of a war of words around it. I'm sure both sides will try and use it because it works for both sides. It works both for Lapid and his allies, and it also works for Netanyahu and his allies.
Thank you. Daniel Pike says, do tell us about Knesset unions and disunions as promised.
Well, there has been quite a lot. Probably most chiefly is basically the dismemberment of Yamina. Yamina today is pretty much Ayelet Shaked Shirley Pinto, who is the first ever deaf member of Knesset, has moved to Benny Gantz's party. Kara, who was the big sort of hope of the Independent Workers Union, those who felt very much that they weren't looked after. It was a big union, a big movement a couple of years ago, entering on the Yamina list under Bennett, has basically left and started his own party. That's all Israel needs, is another party which isn't going to pass the threshold. And basically it's Ayelet Shaked today. So the great Yamina experiment is pretty much over now that Bennett is gone, and pretty much Kahana left, and many others. We did see this week, we talked about it in previous weeks, the disagreement between the religious Zionist party of Smotrich and the Otzma Yehudit party of Itamar Ben-Gvir. There was a lot of talk about will they, won't they. I said all along that they will end up coming together, and Smotrich will remain at the top of the list, despite the fact that Ben-Gvir is probably responsible for about 2/3 of their popularity at this point. Well, as predicted, they did decide to join together. So that is a great relief to Netanyahu. The fact because he didn't want to take a risk and have Smotrich potentially falling below the electoral threshold. Not that I think he would, but they were flirting with it, with some polls giving them as low as 4 or 5. The other potential big banana skin for Netanyahu, which again, I believe will be sorted out, but it is becoming harder and harder by the day, is the potential breakup of the United Torah Judaism. We've spoken about this in the past, the Hasidic and non-Hasidic wings. Or now there's a great ideological battle, because one of the Hasidic groups called the Bells have accepted a deal by the state of Israel, principally by the finance ministry. And as we know, the finance ministry is run by Victor Liebman, who is, to a certain extent, the greatest enemy, or the way they see it, the greatest enemy of the ultra-Orthodox, or the Bells community, a very significant and powerful community within the Hasidic movement, has accepted a deal that they will teach all the basic subjects, because many of the Haredi schools, ultra-Orthodox schools, do not teach the basic subjects, whether it's English, maths, or sciences. Or they've accepted a deal that they will teach the basic subjects, and they will get further funding from the state. And that's caused all sorts of problems for many other ultra-Orthodox movements, because it will then put pressure on them to accept those kind of a deal. And they do not want to introduce secular, what they claim as secular subjects. So at the moment, Netanyahu is trying very hard to get the two sides together. The two sides are actually getting angry with Netanyahu, because they're saying this is not a political issue, this is an ideological issue. Some even going as far as saying it's a theological issue, and Netanyahu should stay out of it. So there's quite a lot of anger directed at Netanyahu for trying to intercede and getting them together, because as we know, it's in his great interest. If the two parties do not run together, one or maybe both of them will could potentially fall under electoral threshold, thus almost certainly depriving Netanyahu of any chance of reaching his 61. The final big issue on perhaps unions, and there is a great pressure on, is a potential union between Meretz and Labour. There are a lot of people, especially Meretz, who are trying to put pressure on Merav Michaeli to join as a union of Meretz and Labour. They did this before, and it was not considered the most successful. According to polls, a poll tonight that I saw, each party is expected to get 5 seats, but together they're only expected to get 9, which means that they would drop a seat, which doesn't exactly ensure that this union will be a success. Meretz is trying to, and many of its supporters are trying to put pressure on Lapid to ensure that they run together, because their argument is that it would only help Lapid's bloc. I don't see how that's true. I've been involved in and witnessed many of these experiments of parties running together, and usually it's very rare that they are the two parts are stronger together than separate. Having spoken to Merav Michaeli only a couple of months ago on this issue, she is extremely determined to run alone. She believes, like last time, she won't be doing very well in the polls, and then will be a surprise in elections. And if we remember last time, she was also tottering around 4 or 5, and in the end got 9 seats. So she's pretty confident in that. She believes the ideological gaps between her and Meretz are strong enough that each deserves its own place on the political map. So I don't see that. Whereas I've talked about the other unions, I think that I predict that they will and have come together. My prediction is, could be I'll be wrong, that Meretz and Labour will not run together. So those are some of this week's sort of political wrangling, unions or non-unions.
Thank you. Jack Wasserman asks, wouldn't the union of Shaked and Netanyahu be something of Zohar magic?
Say it again. Sorry, I didn't catch that.
My audio is terrible today. Wouldn't the union of Shaked and Netanyahu be something of Zohar magic?
Of Zohar magic?
Just a miracle type of thing.
Oh, it would be a miracle? No, it would be politically expedient. They don't like each other. They attack each other, sometimes below the radar, many times above the radar. And Netanyahu would like nothing less than, which to me doesn't make much sense, but they're attacking her daily to try and keep her below the political below the electoral threshold. To me, it doesn't make much sense because she is the most likely out of all those not currently in his bloc to move across and stand with him. And I think when it comes to it, if it would be between going across to the left, calling for new elections, or making or helping Netanyahu get over 61, I believe that she'll do the latter. And even those in her party, like Yoaz Hendel and Tzvika Hauser, who have both worked with Netanyahu. In fact, all three of them have worked personally with Netanyahu, so there's no ideological differences, but they just do not respect the man. They don't like the man for the way he acts. That's pretty much where each of them stands. So I think personally that they would all hold their nose and join a Netanyahu government. But if they do pass the threshold, I think that's the most likely scenario. So I don't think it's a miracle. They've sat in the government together many times, and ideologically they share a lot more than perhaps Shaked shares with an Lapid or a Gantz or some of the others that she currently shares a government with.
Thank you. And Carrie Hillebrand asks, is Israel close to an agreement with Lebanon on the maritime boundary? How would an agreement impact on elections, if at all?
Well, it does seem that they're getting closer and closer. It does seem that there's compromise on both sides. The big wild card that is worrying many in Israel is what will Hezbollah's reaction? Could this be used as an excuse for Hezbollah to flex its muscles? Hezbollah are certainly not popular at the moment. They're at a bit of a nadir as far as their popularity in Lebanon. And perhaps this could be an excuse to rally its people, to rally its troops, to regain some popularity. And there's a lot of concerns that it could attack the Israeli oil rigs in what the Lebanese would call is disputed or even Lebanese maritime territory. But it does seem that the two parties are getting closer and closer to an agreement. I don't think that it's going to play out electorally one way or another. It's not an issue which engages Israelis too much. If there was a Hezbollah attack and if it was repulsed or whatever, or if God forbid it even led to a wider war, land war, etc., then obviously that would play out very much. But at the moment, it's a very technical, even technocrat matter. And I'm sure it'll be resolved at some point because the Americans are trying to put a lot of pressure on both sides to resolve it. But I don't think it will become a major political issue.
All right. Well, thank you so much. We've come to the close of our webinar and podcast. Ashley, thank you again for taking time to update us this week. And for our viewers and listeners, please join us Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern for a webinar with Irena Zuckerman discussing the evolving Tehran-Moscow axis. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.